intent on seizing Darius and ending the war. Observing the danger, Darius's dutiful brother Oxathres led the royal cavalry bodyguard into Alexander's path, who, despite fighting doggedly, were promptly slaughtered. In the desperate struggle,
Damn!
source
Alexander what? Darius, bro.
relates how Darius even managed to wound Alexander in the leg before being carried into danger by the spooked horses of his royal chariot.
Oh, shoot. All right. Continuing Alexander the Great,
In our previous episode
Kings and
on the
Generals
conquest of Alexander the Great, we covered
series.
how after his first victory at the Granicus River, the king successfully besieged the cities of Miletus.
Yeah, I'm just gonna
And
skip.
the harnessed Persian juggernaut was coming west. The only quest, the Battle of and the sponsor of this video, Manscaped, is here to help
Yeah,
with this.
skip.
Christmas came early.
Skip.
Had been settled. Alexander divided the army in two. Parmenion marched off to the north with orders to secure the inland territories of Asia Minor between Sardis and Gordium, while Alexander took the rest on an eastward march along the coast. Moving into Lycia as 334 passed into 333, the Macedonians subdued and received the surrender of over 30 towns, including Telmessos, Xanthus, and Phaselis. Following a brief spat with some Pisidian Hillfort brigands, who reportedly burned their own families to death rather than have them fall into Macedonian hands.
What the
Alexander
hell?
passed in
Bro, the video just started and it's already going. Oh my
Phrygia
gosh, the
and
video
swiftly
just
reached the linchpin
started.
town of Kelene. As
Golly,
it
man.
possessed a nigh impregnable acropolis, Alexander was forced to accept the defenders' terms that if no relief arrived within a certain period, they would surrender. After personally waiting 10 days, the king decided to move on. To conclude matters at Kelene, Alexander appointed a relatively obscure old guard officer to serve as satrap of Phrygia and assigned him 1,500 men to deal with any resistance. This aging, grizzled but unassuming general would, in the course of 3 decades, rocket from a mere governorship in Phrygia to almost winning the entire empire Alexander was in the process of creating. He was Antigonus the One-Eyed.
Hey, that's a hard name, bruh.
Kelene, Alexander
The
marched
One-Eyed.
north to Gordium, the ancient royal seat of the mythological Phrygian monarch Midas. Here, he cut or somehow otherwise undid the Gordian Knot, an act that traditionally dictated Alexander was destined to become ruler of all Asia. Fortunate events elsewhere were to grant further credence to this newfound destiny.
What even was the Gordian Knot or whatever that thing was? I remember when I first reacted to the Kings and Generals Alexander the Great series, like he kind of just said the same thing, but it's like, why was that thing even like knotted up there in the first place? Like, what was the whole significance of it? Like, and who even did that?
After his dogged, albeit failed, defense of Halicarnassus, Memnon of Rhodes had finally been granted the Great King's green light to carry out the strategy he'd proposed before the Granicus, scorched earth and a second front. Darius also funneled his favourite Greek general plenty of treasure, with which he energetically recruited another professional mercenary army and saw to the maintenance of his 300 to 400 ship fleet. With this powerful seaborne force at his disposal, Memnon launched an assault on the Aegean islands. Kos and Samos came over to the Persians, followed by Chios and even the great port Mytilene on Lesbos. Meanwhile, the Rhodians' agents and spies went through Greece, priming the always rebellious city-states to revolt against Alexander when the time was right. In strategic command, Memnon seems to have truly been in his element. All of a sudden, a Persian counter-invasion of Greece looked entirely possible, and Alexander's overextension into Asia Minor seemed foolish at best. However, at this moment of greatest danger and Memnon's highest point, the Rhodian general suddenly fell ill and died in summer 333.
Nah, bruh. Divine intervention. You cannot tell me that was not divine intervention, bro.
Who received the news at Ankara in May or June, was elated. The indirect Second Front plan was Memnon's own, and without its mastermind, the endeavor completely collapsed. Macedon was safe.
Bro! Oh, freak out. Bro, it was still a good idea. Why would anyone not go and do it? What?
When the disastrous news reached Susa, Darius III called together a conclave of senior advisors and allies to establish what exactly was to be done. The majority of these Persian counselors advised Darius to confront Alexander now, in person. The troops would fight better with their great king alongside them. One of the detractors, a fervently anti-Macedonian Athenian mercenary commander exiled by Alexander, known as Charidemus, hotly argued that it was sheer stupidity to risk the empire on such a gamble. An experienced general, such as himself, he argued, somewhat self-servingly, ought to be sent to conduct the war. Darius agreed at first, but the throng of Persian advisors balked at the idea and shouted it down, even accusing the Greek of wanting to betray them to Alexander. Fiery-tempered Charidemus shot back, raving about the Persian lack of fighting will and manliness. His tirade so offended Darius that the king subsequently had Charidemus executed.
Oh, that was a dumb idea. I ain't gonna lie, Darius. That was a... Yeah, I ain't gonna lie. This guy knew what he was talking about.
Therefore, the great king marched to Babylon, gathered his many vassals from across the empire, and summoned their armies. Meanwhile, at Ankara, Alexander received the altogether insincere submission of the provinces of Cappadocia and Paphlagonia before marching southeast to the Cilician Gates, which was
insincere.
held by a small force of Arsames' troops.
I like that wording, kings in general, insincere.
However, in a stroke of luck Alexander would later recount as his greatest, Arsames and most of his men were busy burning and ruining the Cilician plain in accordance to Memnon's scorched earth strategy, allowing Alexander to seize the mountain pass in a night attack. Realizing what had just happened, Arsames fled to rendezvous with the king, and Alexander entered Tarsus on September 3rd, 333. After jumping into a freezing river, the king was left debilitated by a bout of illness for several weeks. During this time, he sent Parmenion around the Gulf of Alexandretta to scout out the situation and hold the crucial passes between Syria, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. In the course of this mission, Parmenion established a base of operations at a small town called Issus, and established that a massive Persian army was occupying Soki beyond the Syrian gates. Once Alexander recovered, he marched the entire army around the Gulf. Perhaps acting on misinformation, the king left his wounded at Issus before continuing south and arriving opposite the Syrian gates, where he expected Darius to come from. He didn't, preparing for his coming stroke by sending his baggage to Damascus. Instead, employing what in hindsight was a brilliant strategic maneuver, the Persian royal army, accompanied by Darius's wife, mother, and children, as was Persian custom, circled around and took a long route through the northern Amanic Gate, descending on Issus from the north. Every wounded Macedonian soldier found there had his hands severed, and Alexander was now cut off. Initially not believing that the Persians were behind him, Alexander sent a galley up the coast to establish the truth. When the vessel returned with confirmation that Darius was indeed at hand, the king immediately grasped the severity of the situation and gathered the unit commanders. He gave a speech, first emphasizing how superior in the arts of war they were than the enemy, and then of the advantages to be gained. While the Persians occupied a position on the Issus plain in the late afternoon, near a river known as Pinarus, Alexander, who was about a dozen miles south, fed the bulk of his army a hot meal in preparation for the coming march.
Smart. Smart. Always make sure that your enemies are fed. I said fled. But no, that's actually like really smart, Alexander. Like the little things count, bro. You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised what hunger does to a person. Hell, I would even go as far as say what thirst does, bro. Oh my goodness, thirst is worse than hunger, hands down.
The king sent mounted scouts to scope out the road between the Macedonian army and its destination. When night fell, Alexander marched his whole army to the high ground at a pass known as the Pillar of Jonah, from where he could see the Achaemenid campfires glimmering across the plain. The well-fed soldiery now also got the rest and recuperation.
Is that like... Is that the same Jonah from like the Bible, Jonah and the whale, or is that like just a different Jonah? I'm just looking at that wondering.
It required, sleeping for many hours. Just before daybreak, the army rose from its slumber and began a disciplined march up the narrow coastal road. Although confined to columns at first due to the terrain, with infantry units in front and cavalry behind, more Macedonian warriors were gradually brought forward as the terrain opened up, slotting seamlessly into the formation. When Darius received word that Alexander was closing in, contrary to his expectations, he sent a force of skirmishers and most of the cavalry to ford the Pinarus, aiming to prevent the Macedonians interrupting or even seeing his deployment. It was probably around this time that Alexander arrived opposite the stream with his infantry regiments lined up with the sea on his left and foothills to the right. The majority of Alexander's cavalry now massed on the right flank, and all of a sudden, the long-awaited showdown was now imminent. It is incredibly difficult to establish exactly how many soldiers Darius III had with him at Issus in 333, a fact that makes charting the course of the battle that much harder. Typically hyperbolic ancient sources, such as Arrian and Plutarch, estimate Persian strength as anywhere from 250,000 all the way to 600,000, numbers which are clearly excessive.
Yeah, I was about to say, no freaking way!
State that Darius's army was no larger than Alexander's, at between 40 and 60.
Yeah, that's more.
For our purposes,
that makes more
we
sense.
will estimate that the Persian army at Issus was around 100,000 strong, outnumbering Alexander 2-1. King of Kings Darius III, manning the royal chariot.
I don't really think he should do it like that, because if Darius had truly outnumbered Alexander, his strategy would probably been a lot different throughout the whole battle. And this is the thing, numbers always influence the way how like a strategy is going to be played throughout a battle. So I think it would actually be more accurate to try and get the more accurate number for us to understand like why Darius did what he did and whatnot, you know? Because if he truly had 100,000, right, and he does something like dumb in the battle, it'd be like, why would you do that when you have this much men, right? I just pointing that out.
Was stationed front and center. Surrounding his immediate person were the infamous Persian immortals, the royal bodyguard, whose number never dropped below 10,000. Off to either flank were 10,000 Greek mercenaries, and further still were units of mixed Persian infantry, known as Kadekis, fronted by archers. The second line was made up entirely of lightly equipped levies. Now that the infantry was arrayed, Darius brought his myriad cavalry back across the Pinarus. Our sources tell us of Medes and Hyrcanians, but we can infer the presence of Paphlagonians, Cappadocians, Cilicians, Bactrians, Sogdians, and even steppe nomads from beyond the frontier, massing on the flatter seaward side of the battlefield. Another small Persian unit was sent to occupy the hills behind Darius's extreme left flank, to threaten the Macedonian right flank and rear. As with his infantry deployment at the Granicus a year earlier, Alexander's main battle line Sarissa phalanx was divided into 6 brigades. They were led, from left to right, by officers Amyntas, Ptolemy, Meleager, Craterus, Perdiccas, and Coenus. To the left of the standard phalanx were Cretan archers and Thracian javelinmen, while to the right were the elite Hypaspists under Nicanor. They were flanked to the right by the Macedonian king and his customary strike force, companion cavalry under Philotas, Paeonian light horse, Agrianes, and archers, supplemented by the Thessalian division. His army was still about 40,000 strong in total. Both forces now prepared for the clash to come, but Alexander saw 2 matters of concern that required attention. First and foremost was the overwhelming concentration of devastating Achaemenid cavalry opposing Parmenion on the left. If the order of battle stayed as it was, Darius's horse would simply sweep his army off the field. To remedy this, the king swiftly adjusted his plan, sending the Thessalians across the battlefield to reinforce his second-in-command as covertly as possible. Second, but still troublesome, were the Persian ambushers positioned in the hills. Alexander dealt with them by detaching a force of Egrienes and light cavalry, and sending them to secure the heights while the main battle went ahead. However, the pinpoint accuracy of the slingers comprising part of this raiding force succeeded in dislodging the enemy so quickly that its bulk was able to rejoin the main line of battle. Just 300 cavalry were seconded to keep an eye on the skittish enemy. With his concerns dealt with, Alexander ordered a slow, measured and deliberate advance to begin across his entire line, periodically halting in order to bait Darius into attacking first. The Persian king did not fall for it, instead keeping his line solidly behind the Pinarus. At last, when the armies were about to enter missile range, Alexander rode from one end of his line to the other, shouting words of encouragement to the highest officers and the lowliest footmen alike by name. He told the Macedonians of their valor and Philip, the Greeks of the injuries Persia had inflicted upon them in centuries past, and the loot-oriented Thracians of the booty that was waiting just for them. According to Rufus, as the great
Where Alexander got that talk no jutsu, bro. Alexander really put all his stats into charisma, Mountain Blade Bannerlord.
king then galloped back to his position at the head of his right wing, the Persian front raised a great cry of battle, which was then returned by the Macedonians with equal vigor. Then, almost simultaneously, both Darius's massive
That's kinda hype though.
flank and Alexander's strike force on the other side of the field.
That is hype. That is hype. What a way to start a battle, bro. That's
Together with
that's
the
hype.
Central Macedonian phalanx, launched their attempted hammer blows. It was now a question of time. Parmenions' Thessalian and allied cavalry was beleaguered and outnumbered, and would eventually collapse. But would that crunch point come before Alexander could win the battle? The warrior king of Macedon charged directly across the Pinarus at the head of his picked force of companions and others, delivering a critical strike to the units opposing him almost immediately. The Xyston-wielding cavalry wedge first smashed into the screen of Achaemenid archers, killing many and driving the rest back into the infantry behind them. Without slowing for a moment, Alexander barreled on and smashed through the first infantry line as well, utterly collapsing Darius's left wing. Unfortunately for the king, the battle elsewhere was taking a bad turn. Parmenions' gallant horsemen were essentially surrounded by the Persian cavalry and fighting a losing battle, but that was to be expected. More disconcerting was the situation in the center of the battlefield. Perhaps drawn in the wake of their king's charge, some of the rightward phalanx regiments and hypaspists had drifted yet further to the right, opening up a gap in the line. This, combined with the rough terrain near the stream, diminished the integrity of the wall of Macedonian Sarissa.
No!
Before Phalangites could regroup on the far bank and reorder their formation, Darius's highly trained Greek mercenary contingent, 1,000 strong and armed with shorter spears that were better suited to such uneven ground, came to grips with them. What ensued was a brutal slogging match. Macedonian soldiers fighting tooth and nail to best their Greek enemies amid the steep, bramble-overgrown bank of the Pinarus. The inflexible phalanx's inexorable advance proved itself exorable indeed. Noticing the newly opened gulf between the Macedonian infantry units, a force of Greek mercenaries attempted to drive into it and break the invaders' phalanx apart. All of a sudden, the Phalangites began withdrawing. The situation might have turned especially sour if not for the prudent intervention of Ptolemy, son of Seleucus, accompanied by veterans and officers who fought to keep the line steady and plug the gap. 120 of them lost their lives in this ferocious melee, together with Ptolemy himself. Still, the momentum in the center was with the Persians. Fresh from his relatively simple task of rolling up Darius's left wing, Alexander got as good a look as he could at the state of the battlefield and quickly decided what to do next. Pivoting inward from the now exposed Persian left, the companions swung around and charged the flank and rear of the Greek mercenaries in the center. This assault relieved a significant amount of
Bro, Darius, how could you... Why did Darius not know that Alexander destroyed his freaking flank? How did Darius not know that? That's what I was sitting there just watching this thinking, okay, Darius, like your whole flank is destroyed. surely you should have gotten reports that your flank is destroyed. No, like, I need someone explain that. Like, this should have been kind of obvious what Alexander would have done.
On the Macedonian phalanx, allowing it to regain formation and continue advancing across the river. The momentum has now shifted the other way. Now, either by accident or on purpose, Alexander and his elites found themselves tantalizingly close to Darius's position. The king laid eyes on the Persian Great King, and with Homeric spirit launched an all-out attack, intent on seizing Darius and ending the war. Observing the danger, Darius's dutiful brother Oxathres led the royal cavalry bodyguard into Alexander's path, who, despite fighting doggedly, were promptly slaughtered. In the desperate struggle, source
Alexander what? Darius, bro.
relates how Darius even managed to wound Alexander in the leg before being carried into danger by the spooked horses of his royal chariot.
Oh, shoot.
The vehicle was quickly brought up, allowing the king to flee the battlefield.
Oh, wait, Darius actually wounded Alexander? Wow.
The departure of their near-deific monarch and the collapse of their infantry, the Persian cavalry assailing Parmenion fell apart and routed, along with the rest of the army. Arrian's account of the battle, on the other hand, differs significantly. In his version, once Alexander had routed the Persian ambushers stationed on his side of the river, he slowly advanced his army to the river. As soon as he came within missile range of the Persians, the Macedonian king initiated the battle, charging across the river with his companions to minimize casualties from the arrow fire. This detachment crashed into the Persian left flank, forcing them to give ground. In the center, however, the Persian force was pushing back the Macedonian phalanx as it attempted to scale the banks of the river, and Greek mercenaries were also attacking the phalanx's right flank, left exposed due to Alexander's charge. More importantly, the Persian right had charged Parmenion's wing once the phalanx was engaged, and was pushing back the Thessalians placed against them. This, then, was the moment of crisis. The Macedonian center and left needed to hold long enough for Alexander to rout the Persian left and swing back to be the hammer on the anvil. Fortunately, Alexander's initial charge had been devastating, and the Persian left soon crumbled. Quickly he gathered his force together once again and rode to the rescue of the phalanx, hitting the Persian center in the flank and rear. It was at this point that Darius, seeing his left flank destroyed and his center near surrounded, fled the battle. The Persian right flank, though having been rather successful in their fight against Parmenion's flank, saw that the battle was now lost and pulled back, initiating a general rout.
Okay, that makes more sense, I'm not gonna lie. That account sounds more accurate, to be honest.
By all accounts,
because I was so confused why Darius, like in Alexander's account, like the way how Darius was acting was like, okay, that's very strange, extremely strange. But that makes sense. The way how, like, Arrian's account here, the way how Arrian describes that, it actually makes sense.
The Battle of Issus was over by early evening, but Alexander wasn't close to finished yet. To destroy the Persian king's army wasn't enough. He wanted Darius. So while the Macedonian soldiery set about killing Persian stragglers and looting the great king's staggeringly lavish camp, the victorious monarch began chasing Darius, who was about half a mile ahead of his cavalry. Only 25 miles later, when darkness finally fell, did Alexander return empty-handed, Darius having escaped across the mountains. In the meantime, the triumphant Macedonian army had been dividing the spoils of victory in the Persian camp. This included vast quantities of gold, silver, fine clothes, jewelry, and as a consequence of Persian custom, all of the royal women who had accompanied their King of Kings to the battlefield. Less noteworthy,
oh my god, that's funny.
Captives were treated incredibly poorly by the soldiery.
Oh, I bet.
There are myriad stories about what Alexander did when he returned. These include Alexander's care and reverence towards Darius's immediate family, and the king's good humor when Darius's mother mistook the king's friend and likely lover Hephaestion for Alexander. But the most telling is related by Plutarch. Upon returning from pursuit, Alexander came to the royal tent, which had been prepared for him by pages, overflowing as it was with luxurious furniture, beautiful servants, and treasures beyond.
I just realized something. Why is Alexander portrayed as blonde? His hair is darker than... I'm pretty sure his hair is darker than this.
Count. Walking further into the magnificent property at the fore of his closest companions, Alexander saw the great golden bath of the king. The basins and pitchers and tubs and caskets, all of gold and curiously wrought. Although a royal and used to comfort, the Macedonians would have almost certainly never seen anything like this, let alone owned it. So after surveying his prodigious new wealth, Alexander turned to his friends and said the words, "This, as it would seem, is to be a king." These post-battle anecdotes are particularly illustrative to us. Arrian writes how he cannot but admire Alexander for treating the royal women with such respect and being magnanimous in victory, thereby highlighting the king's admirable personality. But this initial taste of oriental luxury and Alexander's reaction to it foreshadows the near despot that he would eventually become, believing he was to be worshipped like a god. But for now, Alexander had won the Battle of Issus in emphatic fashion. With it, the western half of the Achaemenid Empire was now open for conquest. In the next episode, we will talk about the Siege of Tyre. If you want to catch that video, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be...
Well... You know what I'm gonna say, but if you're new to my channel and this is your first time watching, go check out my other reactions. But before you do that, if you have any suggestions to me, comment down below. If you know there's videos that I would definitely like to react to, definitely make sure you like the video so that my stuff stays on the algorithm. All right, and honestly, yeah, I don't really have much to say. You know, thank you for watching and goodbye.